Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Sam Belknap, and I have the privilege of directing the Island Institute Center for the Marine Economy, where we seek to ensure that Maine's islands and coast have an enduring and prosperous marine economy. It is such a pleasure to welcome you all to this screening of our latest film in our Climate of Change series, Aquaculture for People and Planet. To begin, I wanted to take a moment to thank the people and organizations who made this event and film possible. These include our funders and longtime partners, Builders Vision, World Wildlife Fund, and Jane's Trust. Thank you for supporting this work and believing in our mission. I want to extend a special thanks to one of this morning's panelists, Matt Moretti of Bangs Island Mussels, whose powerful story is featured prominently in this film. Matt's leadership in sustainable aquaculture here in Maine is part of what makes this story so compelling. And an additional thanks to our staff panelists, Dr. Susie Arnold and Sam Feldman, for joining us this morning. Today's film, Aquaculture for People and Planet, shines a light on the potential for aquaculture, not just as a growing part of our coastal economy, but also as a solution for a more sustainable and resilient future. To accelerate this solution, Island Institute commissioned greenhouse gas assessments, which will be featured in today's film. These assessments analyze and measure the amount and sources of greenhouse gases associated with specific activities to better understand the emissions footprint of Maine lobster, mussels, kelp, and oyster supply chains. The goal of these studies is twofold: to assess options that enable seafood businesses to reduce emissions, lower operating costs, and adapt to changing climate and market conditions, and also to highlight opportunities to implement state-level policies and programs that promote energy-efficient, climate-smart practices. This work is exactly the kind of bold, community-driven innovation we strive to support at Island Institute. For more than 40 years, we've been committed to helping island and coastal communities navigate change, whether it's economic, environmental, or demographic. We believe that the people most affected by challenges should be at the center of the solutions. Our Climate of Change film series, including today's film, is part of this effort. These stories are more than films. They inspire, inform, and elevate the work of people on the ground. And in this series, as in all of our work, we like to keep it simple. Show what's possible, share what works, and make it easier for communities to take the next step. And that's what you'll see today: innovation rooted in tradition, collaboration fueled by partnership, and communities leading the way. I hope the film sparks ideas, questions, and maybe even new connections. And I hope you enjoy the panel conversation after the screening. We're joined by a fantastic group of speakers who live this work every day. Now, after the webinar, you're going to be presented with a brief survey, and we would appreciate your feedback as we seek to make these events as informative as possible. And with that, enjoy the film, and we look forward to the conversation after.
We took over Bangs Island Mussels in 2010. It was very, very tiny. We had one employee, one little boat, and a barge. But we believed in what we were doing. We believed in the concept. We actually started to embody the dream that we had of doing a lot of good, not just for the environment, but also for the people around us. My name is Matthew Moretti. I'm the CEO of Bangs Island Mussels. The basic concept of how we farmed mussels hasn't really changed over the last few decades. We use large floating rafts out in the ocean, and we hang ropes from those rafts, and the mussels grow in those ropes. That's like the concept. Basically, mussel farming is as simple as you can get at a conceptual level. We put mussels in the water on our ropes, and we don't do anything else to them except to protect them. We don't have to use any additions at all. No feed, no fertilizer, no chemicals of any kind. They just exist and eat off of the nutrients naturally around them in the water. So at that conceptual level, mussel farming is super simple. Mussels are incredibly effective and efficient filter feeders. So by eating that phytoplankton from the water, they can actually help control the nutrient inputs into our ecosystem.
Island Institute is very much a data-driven organization. We know that the seafood economy is hugely important to Maine. We are also concerned about making sure the foods that we're eating have a relatively low impact on the climate.
Almost across the board, things farmed in the ocean are a more efficient source of protein for people to eat than protein grown on land.
We wanted to really figure out our lobster, our oysters, our mussels, climate-friendly local food sources.
Island Institute, in partnership with Bangs Island Mussels, commissioned a study of their greenhouse gas footprint, in part to figure out, what the overall emissions are, but more importantly, to find where any hot spots are, or any outsized sources of emissions that we could help potentially find solutions to, and that will help the business both improve, its carbon footprint, but then also help its bottom line, because generally, places where you're emitting carbon into the atmosphere, you're also burning through dollars pretty quickly. They don't need vague answers. They want to know exactly what they can do to improve their business, both in terms of climate solutions, but then also in terms of how to save money. Right? We're not here to find numbers. What we're here to do is to find ways to help people keep working on the water, keep making money, and we're also here to fight climate change. That's the point.
It points to two big sources of emissions over any others, by a lot. Loss in yield due to shell breakage, right? So that means they're coming back with less food on each trip, right, than they could. And then the other is fuel use while operating their boats on the farm. The marine decarb team here has been working for a while on smaller scale electric outboards, hybridization projects for lobster boats, so a much larger scale boat, and that all has the potential to help these businesses lower their carbon footprint. It's in the future, but maybe not as far in the future as we might have thought.
If you look at the lifespan of an electric motor and batteries, it is affordable over the life of that technology, but up front, it's way too expensive for most businesses. We want to change that so that people can stay in business and keep operating and keep lowering their emissions, and then they just see the savings by not having to buy gas for the rest of the time they're on the water.
Humans are emitting a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, primarily carbon dioxide, or CO2. A lot of this carbon dioxide, about a quarter to a third of it, is absorbed by the ocean. This causes the ocean's chemistry to change, making it more acidic. Shellfish, like mussels, have a harder time growing their shells in acidic water, making them more brittle and vulnerable to breakage during harvesting and processing. Island Institute partnered with Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences to conduct a study that showed that kelp, like a land plant, absorbs excess carbon dioxide in its environment as it grows. This allows for improved shell production in nearby shellfish. It's an environmental win. Both of these species are basically cleaning the water through taking up excess nutrients. They're helping each other. The kelp is taking up excess carbon dioxide, and it's growing better as a result, and it's improving the water chemistry so that the mussels can have thicker shells. And so then when they're harvested, if you can go from 13% broken shells down to 5%, because they're just a little bit thicker, you're taking more unbroken mussels home on the boat, and you're lowering your carbon footprint.
We started farming kelp, the very beginning of the industry in the United States, because it was an opportunity to do more good for the ocean around us. It was also a cool, fun, interesting opportunity to just experiment and see, like, could we do this? And we did, and it worked. By farming mussels and kelp together, I like to say that we're farming more of an ecosystem rather than a monoculture. And as we grow and evolve as a company, we plan to do more than just mussels and kelp. We want to explore what's out there and build efficiencies on the knowledge and infrastructure that we already have to have even more products and be even more robust and resilient as a company into the future.
There aren't many sources of emissions when you're doing this type of farming. Mussels consistently fall within, when you're comparing them to other sources of protein, they are lower, far lower than any other animal protein, and even lower than tofu.
Mussel farming is one of the most sustainable sources of protein production out there. When we go out to harvest, we fill up the boat. It's typically around 6,000 to 7,000 pounds each harvest. And that's a lot of food, that's a lot of meals for people. We assumed that what we're doing is great for the environment, and by participating in the study, we found that out for sure.
Mussels have such potential in the Gulf of Maine. I'd love to see more commercial mussel farms here in the Gulf of Maine. They thrive in the cold, clean waters that we have here.
It is particularly exciting when you think about the fact that it's actually an affordable seafood. It's kind of a seafood for the people.
Mussels are an incredible species, and I don't think they've really gotten enough credit. They haven't gotten the credit that they deserved traditionally. And they are a species that at a big enough scale can actually help feed the world. They can grow all over the place, they're highly nutritious, and they're accessible to almost any demographic of people because they're not that expensive. They're one of the least expensive seafoods you can buy. They're like a center of the plate protein. You can eat a dish of mussels for a meal, and that's very good for you. I'm really happy with where we are now. I'm happy with the adaptations we've made as a company to better respond to the environment around us. I'm happy with the knowledge that we're now bringing in to understand the ocean. I think we're on the cusp of something even greater and better.
I continue to be inspired every time I see that film. If I could ask our panelists to join us, turn on your video. While folks are joining, just a reminder, if you have questions either about the film or for the panelists as we have our conversation, please feel free to get those in the chat. I have a few questions to start us off, and then we're happy to open it up to audience questions. So please feel free to post those in the chat and we will get to them as we are able. To begin, I'd like to ask our panelists, going from Susie to Sam to Matt, to briefly introduce yourself, talk about the work that you do and what your favorite part of your job is. So Susie, if you could kick us off.
Thanks, Sam. My name is Susie Arnold. I'm the senior ocean scientist at Island Institute. I think my favorite part of the job is sharing information amongst aquaculturists, fishermen, and scientists.
Great, thanks. Sam.
Hi, everyone. Sam Feldman. I'm a community development officer at Island Institute. I work in the Center for Marine Economy and lead our aquaculture-related work. I think my favorite part of the job is generally, I am lucky enough to work with folks like Matt and the other farmers who participated in this study, which lets me kind of maintain a connection all the way from, talking about state and national level policy all the way down to what's happening at an individual farm on the water. And that's a pretty unique and interesting place to live.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Over to you, Matt.
All right, yeah, I'm Matthew Moretti. I'm the CEO of Bangs Island Mussels. We are a sustainability-focused aquaculture company based in Portland, Maine. We've been operating here for 15 years, and we grow mussels, kelp, and just recently we started farming oysters as well. And we're about 600,000 pounds of mussels a year right now, hopefully 100,000 pounds of kelp, and TBD on how many oysters we can grow. But we're working on that as well. And yeah, as I mentioned, everything we do is driven by our goal of helping the ocean and producing delicious, nutritious food for communities across the country. My favorite part of the job, really, I think, is innovating. Aquaculture is a relatively new form of food production, and with that newness comes a lot of challenges or problems that need to be solved. So I end up, and my crew, our team ends up innovating a lot and trying to solve those challenges as we come up on them. So I like that part.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Well, thank you for the hard work, for the innovation of you and your crew, and for your partnership on work like this. So Susie, to start us off, this is the 7th of our Climate of Change films. Could you talk a little bit more about how these films fit into our larger science and data communication strategy?
Sure. Thanks, Sam. So our vision for our science and data translation work at Island Institute is first that Maine's island and coastal communities and businesses have the knowledge that they need to make informed decisions. Secondly, that policies include the best available science and are inclusive of the needs of island and coastal communities and businesses that we know are uniquely vulnerable to climate change and disruptions to the marine economy. So the result there is that these communities and businesses are at the leading edge of adapting to a rapidly changing world. So we do this particularly through building agency and connection and taking action. So in the 13 years that I've been at Island Institute in my role as a marine scientist, this has required me to focus on concerns such as warming water, ocean acidification, sea level rise, storm science. Those are the big ones, I'd say. And one of the ways that we've been building agency is through this educational Climate of Change film series. So we've been creating short films like this since 2013, which has come to be known as our Climate of Change video series. We started out back in 2013 with a film on warming waters and how it's impacting the lobster fishery. Then we went over to Alaska to learn about how they're dealing with ocean acidification. Then we had staff going down to Florida, to Apalachicola, where we learned how that community is responding to a collapse of their wild oyster fishery. So those were kind of our first 3 right off the bat. Then we produced one on shellfish and seaweed, that burgeoning industry here in Maine. Then one on sea level rise from the perspective of an island final haven and how they're handling that issue. And then before this one that we just saw was one on energy transitions in the working waterfront. So simultaneous to these films and that production, we also put on a Climate of Change workshop series. So these were scientific convenings, fairly large in-person gatherings. We started on the topic of climate and fisheries. Then we moved over to ocean acidification, kind of turning the headlights on to that issue here in the Gulf of Maine. And more recently have had large convenings around sea level rise, just to name a few. So simultaneous to the awareness raising through the films, we had these large gatherings of scientists and practitioners and business owners. So in short, I'd say that we really strive to be a trusted voice on coastal issues through information sharing in accessible formats to diverse audiences, and also building lasting relationships with experts.
Great. Thank you so much, Susie. And these are big, complicated issues, so thank you for your work in helping to translate them and making them more accessible for the coast. Sam, can you talk a little bit more, and you mentioned this in the film, but can you talk more about why the Island Institute engaged in these greenhouse gas assessments and how they fit into the broader work within the Center for the Marine Economy?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great place to kind of kick things off. We started this work with Luke's Lobster. There was a unique opportunity to partner with a very vertically integrated lobster business. So that allowed us to have a very large scope for this initial greenhouse gas assessment, looking at everything from bait sourcing to production of materials, all the way through, turning on the lights at their restaurants around the world. So that was a unique opportunity that we took advantage of as a way to both look at emissions from the perspective of climate change, but then also from a business sustainability standpoint, like how do you either lower or stabilize costs of operating in a world where it seems like everything's getting more expensive every day. And then from there, it really became clear that in that instance, fuel use from boats was a major source of emissions, a very significant source of emissions. So that started our electric boat work, which has now become our marine decarbonization work. But we also wanted to kind of get more data and make sure that we weren't taking one example and building a whole area of work off of that. So these other assessments kind of follow that trend where we still see a lot of emissions from boat use. It fits into our broader work, kind of as I said before. It really is another way of looking at business sustainability. So we often are thinking about like the broader we in society. How do we make things more valuable? How do we make more money? And the flip side of that is how do we lower or stabilize operating costs? And so some of the things we found require newer technology with higher upfront investment, like electric boats. But then other solutions that we can talk about maybe later we're much more familiar with and are much lower cost and more accessible to businesses.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam. Data point in the film that I love, which is mussels have a lower carbon footprint than tofu. That's a great result, but as you embark on a study like this, you don't know that is going to be the result. So you're both a very busy business person and entrepreneur, solving lots of challenges. Why take on this work in partnership with the Island Institute? What did you hope to get out of it? And why did you take on that level of risk, not knowing what the data was going to show?
Yeah, good question. I guess it was a risk, but it's kind of like the whole point. We couldn't say no. This is the most important question that we really have as a company. We started out trying to do some good for the environment and produce food for people, and we thought that it was true. Everything we had read, everything we had heard, proof we didn't know. So the opportunity to have some outside organization, some objective observer come and tell us, like, you are actually doing good. This thing that you built your whole business and life around because you thought it was good is actually good. And this is the proof. Like, we believe us, was an incredible opportunity for us. So of course we had to do it. And we thought it was going to turn out this way, and we were right. So we're really happy with that, but we didn't have any other choice, and we were really happy to do it and honored to be included in this effort.
Well, thank you for your partnership and your willingness to take on the risk. And I think the results speak for itself. So, Susie, if we could back up a little bit, the film identifies some specific ways that seafood businesses can reduce their carbon footprint, but what are some of the most direct ways that Maine's seafood economy is currently being impacted by climate change?
Yep. Thanks, Sam. So we know seafood businesses have a lot at stake in terms of mitigating climate change because they're seeing the impacts of climate change in their business every day. We also know that more broadly, Maine is experiencing more extremes. So these are from hourly and daily weather to monthly and seasonal climate change. Some examples that are top of mind are the number of marine heat waves in the last decade and a half, the number of record-breaking sea levels along the Maine coast in the last few years, the more intense winter storms, those require no description. Also, the variability of precipitation. We're in the midst of an extended period of drought, and we know that we're more and more just short bursts of intense rainfall. So I would say that that variability is really quite impactful for businesses. Additionally, I'd say, just when we thought we knew what to expect from marine species, those that we depend on, so much has changed from their movements, from the timing of their spawning, the timing of the molt of the lobsters in that fishery, basic predator-prey dynamics that now include like mismatches in timing. So the prey is abundant at a different time, and the predators are not there to consume it at that time. So basic phenology changes. Those rainfall patterns are producing massive runoff events. I'm sure Matt could describe how those are very annoying to his business. Also invasive species. Another thing that I was thinking about as it pertains to this film is the changes that we're seeing on the seafloor in Maine. I mean, most people don't see that, but the seafloor in the Gulf of Maine has changed dramatically, becoming overrun with invasive seaweeds. And these are having impacts on wild kelp beds and also wild mussel beds. Both are wild populations that the farms that we're talking about today really depend on for their spat or their seed, because traditionally spat and seed from mussels and kelp comes from wild populations. So I'd say that really anything that businesses can do to increase the stability and predictability and also reduce one or more of those multiple stressors that they're facing can be really valuable.
Great, thanks, Susie. And that's some heavy stuff, but I think that last comment tees up a great question. And one of the questions we've heard from the audience that I'm going to insert right here is related to this. Like, what are we seeing happen with wild mussel populations? And maybe for both Matt and Susie, I'll defer to one of you to jump in there and talk a little bit more about what we're seeing in the wild.
All right. So yeah, I'll start if that's all right.
Please.
So from what I've been reading and seeing locally is that the wild mussel populations, particularly in southern Maine, are in decline. And that is definitely centered around the intertidal zone, so the area between low and high tide. And if you walk around the coastline in southern Maine, you very easily can see that there are very few mussels around. As far as I understand, the subtidal, so below low tide line, mussel populations are less known. They're harder to study. You can't see them. So there's less known, and they may not be as much in decline, but I believe are still also in decline. And in terms of what's happening on our farm, we have definitely seen variability in what's happening with the wild mussels. We rely on wild mussel spat or larvae as the foundation of our farm. We collect it underneath our rafts and grow it up in the protection of our farm to harvest. And we have seen major variability compared to a decade or two ago in when that mussel spawn happens, when the larvae is produced, and where it sets, and also the other organisms that are competing with that space for that space that the mussels typically can set on. So sea squirts, tunicates, ascidians, they are definitely competing with mussels in different ways that have forced us as a farm to evolve. For better or for worse, we now have to know a lot more about what's happening out in the ocean around us. So we've implemented plankton tows. So we study the plankton. We do 4 different tows a week year round now to understand what's happening with the plankton in the water. So we're looking for shellfish larvae, but we're also looking for sea squirt larvae and phytoplankton to better understand. And that's really been essential to continuing to operate here in southern Maine. So yeah, things are definitely changing around here from our perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. You mentioned in the film that this is simple at a conceptual level, but when you really dig in to address all of these challenges, it becomes really complicated.
Yeah, the devil is in the details.
Susie.
Just a couple things to add. So I get that question. So I've been working in this job for 13 years, and I'd say that is the most common question that I receive from people. And so I'd say like maybe 7 years ago, I polled all of the people studying wild mussel populations and wrote a short column about it in the Working Waterfront newspaper. And since then, I've had a lot more discussions with folks like Pete Petratus, who's been doing there's a marine biologist who's summers on Swans Island, who's got long-term surveys of the intertidal down east. And then folks like Bob Stenick, who have been following these trends for decades. And some of the top reasons that I'm hearing scientists point to would be ocean acidification, green crabs, human foraging, and also just decades of just heavy commercial harvest on the seafloor. So I think, in addition to all those things that Matt mentioned, that's the perspective of what scientists are finding to answer that question.
Thanks, Susie. And Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the farming of mussels, they are able to go through part of their reproductive life cycle and have the potential to contribute back to wild populations through their farming. Am I correct?
Yeah. So all the mussels that we harvest on our farm have gone through sexual maturity, so they actually can and do spawn. So all the mussels we harvest on the farm have already had an opportunity to spawn. So they're producing more larvae that goes out and helps boost the wild population. So instead of depleting a wild resource, the methods that we use to farm are actually helping to increase the wild resource, which I think is a little hard to understand, a little hard to explain, but is pretty cool and makes us feel good about what we're doing.
Yeah,
I
very
think
cool.
I should point out the heavy wild harvesting. I haven't seen that in Southern Maine in over a decade, maybe 20 years. Like there was a period of time, maybe in the 90s, I'm not sure, but there were a lot of commercial draggers out there and heavily exploiting the wild population. And it's interesting to hear that has contributed to the decline these days.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So Sam, Matt has talked a little bit about some of the steps he's taken to kind of address some of these emerging issues and increasing complexity in the marine environment. We as an organization have supported a variety of other projects along the coast related to the production of seafood. Can you talk a little bit about what type of work and where that's showing up and how we've been doing work to support small businesses dealing with some of these changes?
Yeah, thanks. So what we've learned through these assessments is that out of what we've taken a look at, consistently, fuel use in boats is by far and away the highest source of emissions for folks. The battery and charging needs to help folks be able to actually use an electric boat, even if they owned one, are a very large hurdle, especially as you go further up the coast, but even in a place like Portland, where there's a lot of electric supply, but the demand is so high that by the time all that infrastructure gets to the waterfront, a lot of that electricity is used up. So there have been a few interesting cases where we've been able to help folks kind of circumvent that, where, at Bombazine Oysters in the New Meadows, they now have a kind of souped up solar array and battery storage system that we helped them pay for with a Spark grant that now runs all of their processing equipment through electricity, which makes them easier neighbors to have, right? It's a very congested part of the ocean where there's lots of mixed use. So to be able to operate your equipment quietly instead of relying on a gas powered generator is very helpful. But in addition, they have enough production and storage of electricity now where in the near future, when they do have an electric outboard, they plan to trickle charge it on that float. And that works really well with oyster farming because for the way many farms operate, you go out, you grab all the oysters you want to work with for a few hours, you bring them back to your float, and then you're processing them for several hours at a time usually. So if during that time you can have your boat pulled up to the dock and you can be trickle charging it through solar power, then you don't have to have as many batteries on board. That reduces the cost, that increases the logistical possibility of even being able to use one on the water in a smaller boat like oyster farms typically use. A similar example would be at Highland and Brown Boatyard in Brooklyn, Maine. It's not a floating solar system, but we help them purchase a solar system and battery storage system on their pier. So even though the the larger electrical grid infrastructure isn't amenable to charging an electric outboard, they now can charge their electric workboat on their pier without being connected to the grid. And it's the predominant workboat they use these days, from what I understand. We've also, on a larger scale, assisted with many other partners, the construction and implementation of a large, fully operational electric outboard oyster boat for Maine ocean farms. And so that's in Casco Bay, operating every day. It's got twin 120 horsepower equivalent motors. And so they're piloting that and collecting a lot of data with that boat, and also just using it every day as their work boat. And I think those are three exciting examples.
Great. Thanks, Sam. And I think you mentioned this in the film, like the solutions may not be as far away as we once anticipated if we're already seeing these kind of popping up sporadically and even more than sporadically all across the coast. So we'll come back to mussels in a second, but Susie, I want to turn to you and talk a little bit about kelp. We have some great questions coming in around kelp. So could you talk a little bit more about some of the work in exploring different uses for kelp and seaweed that some of our partners at Bigelow have been doing in conjunction with your work around ocean acidification?
Sure. Yes. So, starting in around 2014, we started to partner with Bigelow around the time Dr. Nicole Price took the senior research scientist position there. And we discovered our mutual interest in kelp's potential ability to remediate ocean acidification. So we talked about that body of research in the film, but there are a couple other areas of work being investigated at Bigelow, one of which is the ability of kelp to reduce methane emissions. So using kelp as a food additive for bovines, or in the case of Maine, for cows specifically, to reduce their methane emissions. So that's one large area of work that has the potential to really have a global impact. It's a kind of a little known fact that bovines produce a lot of methane emissions worldwide. And we know here in the United States, we eat a lot of beef. And so feeding cows kelp can have a pretty big impact, it seems. Early research is pointing that way anyway. In addition to that, there's been a global study on the ability of farmed kelps to sequester carbon in the sediments beneath farms. So several farms were investigated about 5 years ago through core work of sediments beneath kelp farms across the world to get a sense of how much of that kelp that's grown on farms is actually sloughed off and reaches the sea floor, and then how much of it actually is retained in the sediments beneath kelp farms. So it turns out that is possible for kelp farms to sequester carbon long-term in sediments. It very much depends on the sediment makeup beneath those farms. So that's some of the climate-related research that I'm aware of that's happening with farmed kelps. There's obviously a ton of other research going into kelp as food products and other types of products that I'm a little less familiar with that maybe Sam or Matt now probably can speak to a little bit more fluently.
And I think that touches on another question that we saw come from the audience. Matt, what happens to your kelp that you grow?
Okay, yeah. Up until this point, all of our kelp has gone into food. So we've worked with Atlantic Sea Farms and some other partners, and basically grown as much raw kelp as we could to feed into their system that they're able to produce various food products out of, seaweed salads, fermented products, noodles, all kinds of stuff. So that's been our most successful avenue. In the early days, we had no customer for our kelp. set up already, and we tried to do some product development of our own that had varying degrees of success that we no longer do. But there's tons of stuff you could do with it. A lot of people traditionally around the world dry it first to stabilize it, and then they can sell it as dried seaweed, or make other various products out of it. There's new exciting work happening about making biostimulants, so almost like a fertilizer for land plants, a biostimulant product that we're starting to explore a little bit, but that could be really cool, particularly for us. It really fits really well with our mission, because we're trying to help the environment, help the ocean, and so it wouldn't be producing food, but it would be sort of creating a circular nutrient cycle from like land nutrients running off into the ocean, stimulating the growth of the kelp that's sucking those nutrients out, helping to stabilize the coastal ecosystem in the water, and then we harvest that kelp, make it into a biostimulant, sort of like fertilizer product, and it can go back onto the land. And help land plants. And the big takeaway is, or the big benefit is, we don't have to take any external fertilizer like a petroleum-based fertilizer and use that on the land instead. So it's like this natural cycle of nutrients that we're really excited about, and hopefully we can get something going with that pretty soon.
Yeah, that's great, Matt. That's really exciting. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So Sam, related to this, there's a great quote that I've heard you say, kind of comparing kelp to other commodity goods and kind of addressing the challenge of turning this crop into something that has higher demand or high value. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of that, kind of some of the comments around that, and what else we're seeing as opportunities in this space?
Sure. Are you referring to just the challenges in turning into something that people actually want?
Yeah, the wheat comparison that I've heard you
Yeah.
make before, which is a
Yeah.
great one.
Sure. Yeah. And for transparency, I stole this from Bree Warner, who has many great quotes about kelp. But, it's very easy to get people to go to a store and buy cookies. It is a lot harder, and maybe even flour. But it's a lot harder to get people to go to the store and buy unprocessed wheat, or go wherever you could do that and buy it, right? So if you look at kelp kind of as in that metaphor, right? So how are you taking kelp and turning the raw kelp that very few people know what to do with or have interest in, and turn it into something that people will want to buy, right? And so there are different ways of going about that. The way that Maine has, for the most part, been doing has been trying to go for the highest value product possible, basically by going for products, food products like the seaweed kimchi that they were making, and the seaweed salads, kelp burgers. And that makes sense economically for a lot of reasons, especially given the space constraints that a lot of farmers face, right? If you're going to be going for a lower value, higher volume product, you have to be able to produce that volume at an efficient enough way. There are then other issues where, for decades now, we've kind of been seeing social researchers around seafood saying, Americans are 10 years away from eating a lot more seafood, or 10 years away from eating a lot more seaweed. And then every 10 years or so, they keep saying, 10 more years, 10 more years. And we're seeing small changes in the right direction, which is great, but nothing to kind of upend that model, where it's harder to get to move a lot of product that's meant for human consumption. I think there are still opportunities there. I think there are additional opportunities if we can scale up, where you are then producing other things, like using it as an ingredient in other products that we use every day, that is just, instead of, you're using that in place of, like Matt said, a petroleum product. So, which would have great climate and broader environmental benefits. And the other benefit is, if you're growing more kelp, even whether or not you're sequestering carbon, which is a very poorly understood overall phenomenon at this point, you're still absorbing nutrients from the water. And water quality, while it's not as headline worthy these days as climate change more broadly, our water quality is still critically important.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam. So thank you, Charles, for a great question around kind of what it takes to actually start a mussel farm, Matt. What are the capital outlays? What's the infrastructure requirement? What's the timeline for profitability around an operation like this?
Yeah. Mussel farming is somewhat difficult. It takes a lot. When we started in 2010, we sort of learned the hard way the lesson of appropriate scale, as in size of your operation. Mussel farming you can't really do small. Mussels are, as I said in the video, the least expensive seafood you can buy, which means in order to make a business that functions out of it, you need to do a lot of them. So it's a high volume endeavor. And to do that volume requires equipment and people, stuff, and the appropriate funding to get it all from the very beginning. So in comparison to other species that we farm in Maine, kelp and oysters, I think you can have success at smaller scales in those other species easier than with mussels. It just takes a lot to get going. So you really got to be all in when you try to start a mussel farm. You have to have. So we use large floating rafts. They're permanently moored. We have a crew now. We have a crew of 20, and the scale that we've achieved so far is good. We intend to continue expanding the operation, sustainably growing the business, of course. And I don't have an actual number, but somewhere around maybe 10 rafts or 6 or 8 rafts, something like that is a scale where the economics start to make sense. And then there's a whole host of other things out there too that you have to consider, like how far away are your rafts? How far is your site? Like what kind of infrastructure do you have on land to move tons of product at a time, instead of say, a few bags of oysters at a time. So there's a lot of considerations, and most of them are you got to have enough, size to make it work.
And I imagine it also takes time to get to that size. So Sam, as folks may not know, you in a former life were also an aquaculturist farming oysters. Can you talk a little bit about some of the regulatory barriers in kind of engaging and entering into aquaculture, especially as people are looking to this as a business diversification opportunity?
Sure, happy to. Right now, if you are applying for a standard lease in aquaculture, you could be facing, even if it gets eventually approved, you could still be facing a three-year or longer wait. After, if we're using oysters as an example, in southern Maine, some of your crop, once you get it in the water after that 3-year wait, may be ready to be harvested and sold 2 years later. So you're looking at overall 5 years before. It's not before you break even by any means. It's before you see a single cent of revenue. And so if you don't have the capital up front to just pay for that yourself, you have to go to a bank and try and convince them to give you the loans for that equipment. That's a very challenging conversation to have. Or you have to get creative with angel investing and things like that, which generally at the scale we're talking about for a new farm, it's kind of a size mismatch between the amount of investment needed and what angel investors are used to dealing with. So you kind of find yourself in this weird middle space of this catch-22, right? Of you can't get started until you have the money, and you don't have the money until you get started. So, which is not unlike other businesses, but it's a little bit amplified with the regulatory timelines that we're often looking at with aquaculture.
Great, thanks for sharing that. We have time for one more question that I want to pass on from the audience, and I'd love to hear everyone's perspective on this. So first, I think just a fact check. Matt, is it true that most of the mussels consumed in the US are imported?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just a quick example of that. Prince Edward Island, our neighbors to the north, they produce 50 or 60 million pounds of mussels a year, half of which are exported into the US. And I think the US farms as a whole, maybe like 9 million pounds in total. So absolutely. And they're not even, Prince Edward Island is one province, and they're not even the biggest producer in the world. So yeah, there's a huge market for mussels in the United States that all of the domestic production is not even getting close to filling. So,
great. And that tees up the question. I'd love to hear everyone's perspective on what can Maine be doing to be more competitive in this space? Any takers?
Okay, all right, I'll go. Uh, it I said this at the last showing, but Sam, you already talked about it. I think it's the regulatory hurdles. I think we need to lower the barriers of entry at the regulatory level to allow more farmers to grow these sustainable crops in Maine. We need to shorten the leasing time. We need to help prop up people in traditional fisheries that are interested in aquaculture, help people get into this and stay into this industry. So that we can grow it and make it into an economic powerhouse in the state that it's becoming on its own, but it should be doing more already. So lowering the regulatory hurdles, shortening leasing time is my take.
Thanks, Matt.
I can jump in next. Matt, how many people do you employ full time?
We have about 20 people on staff right now. Maybe 5 or 6 of those are part-time, so the rest are full-time year-round benefits.
So, especially in Maine, we are often talking about the need for economic development. We need jobs. We need locally produced food. We need affordable nutrition, and we like our environment. And so, like when you think about it when you think about aquaculture, and especially shellfish and seaweed aquaculture in the broader context of the world and the other forms of economic development and food production that are out there, I think that gets lost a lot of the time in conversations about aquaculture on a local level, and then that leads to potentially outsized resistance or discomfort with people having economic activity on the water. If somebody can point to that type of food production, that type of economic activity that can happen in as environmentally friendly a way on land, I would love to see it.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Susie.
I would say, at least in terms of mussel aquaculture, something I'd like to see is a bit more streamlined process for research sites. So sites where researchers who aren't intending to make a profit off of their product can experiment with gear from other countries and can have that opportunity for innovation.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. And I think, Matt, the innovation that you doing, that comes at a real cost for you and your business. But we deeply appreciate the fact that you are doing that to help create some of these solutions. I want to end with a couple comments, but before I do, I just want to remind everyone, we've seen in this film that Maine seafood is a great low emission, high nutrition food source. So please do your part and eat more Maine seafood. And with that, Matt, where can people find your mussels?
Okay, yeah, so we distribute nationally at this point, but the vast majority of our mussels are eaten in restaurants. So, patronize your local eateries. And you can find them in some local harbor seafood shops as well, Harbor Fish Market, things like that around here. But yeah, mostly restaurants.
Great. Thank you, Matt. So Emma, I think you can pull up the last slide. Just want to extend my deepest appreciation to you, Matt, to you, Susie, and to you, Sam, for joining us on the panel today, for doing the work that you do to support our coast every day. And I want to thank all of you who joined us today. If today's film or our conversation inspired you, we encourage you to support this work. Your gift fuels everything from the science-based storytelling that we discussed to real-world solutions for communities facing urgent climate and economic challenges.